Okay, hi everyone. This is Ryan Arori from OSSI, and this is the fourth meeting of the 22-23 UPSFF Working Group. This meeting is being recorded. Just a few logistics before we get started. If you can, try to be on camera. I am not feeling well today, so I am not going to be on camera, so I apologize for not following my own rule. Everyone that is attending as a panelist, you can chat, raise your hand, talk at any time. This is a public meeting, so we also have members of the public that are attending. And for those people, we will have a public comment period towards the end of the meeting where you can provide any public comment on anything that you would like. When you are using the chat feature, just try to remember to send your chat to everyone and not just one specific person, or else not the whole group won't be able to see it. And with me, I have Michelle Yan from the DME and Patrice Swift-Taylor from the DME, who's presenting the slide deck. I think I got everything, Michelle, and I can turn it over to you.
Yep.
Actually, you know what? I know I already forgot something.
Oh,
we have to do roll call. So I will go as usual by alphabetical order of last name. So Michael Bayek.
I'm here.
Great. Josh Boots.
Yeah.
Great. Abraham Clayman.
Here.
Great. Chelsea Coffin.
Here.
Great. Jen Comey.
Here.
Jeanette Fernandez. Don't see her on the participant list. Alan Francois, don't see on the list. Sharon Gaskins.
Here. Good afternoon.
Hi, Sharon. Jessica Giles. No. William Henderson. Ubila Huddleston.
I'm here.
Great. Leicester Johnson. Mary Levy.
Here.
Welcome, Mary. Jack McCarthy.
Here.
Great. Alonzo Montalvo. I saw you before, Alonzo. You're on mute. Or you might be away from your computer. Stephen Regis, I don't see on the list. Kathy Riley. Kathy is not here right now. Allison Rode. I don't see Allison either. Justin Rydstrom.
Here.
Great. Nate Schwartz.
Here.
Great. Fatima Shahi.
Here.
Welcome. Ashley Simpson Baird.
Good afternoon. I'm here.
Drew Snyder.
Here.
Great. Raymond Whedon. Don't see Raymond on the list. Jonathan Weinstein.
Here.
Great. Kevin Wenzel. Don't see Kevin. And Margie Yeager.
Here.
Okay, great. Thank you all. And now, Michelle, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ryan. All right, during our session today, we are going to just do a quick recap of the November meeting to give folks a refresher. We will talk about the costs of some previous recommendations. This was something that came out of the November meeting as a request. Spend a bit of time talking about special education, as I know that was of interest for folks. And then start in a very initial discussion on report recommendations. We're nearing the end of our time together. I think we have 2 more sessions together. And so we want to start this conversation around what we're going to be recommending as a working group in the report, with a reminder that for that portion, we can incorporate into the report nuances where there may be disagreements or differences in recommendations between working group members. And then as always, we'll leave some time at the end in order to allow for public comment during this period, we'll invite members of the public to raise their hands or come off mute to share their opinions, and we can continue our discussion as a working group during that time as well. All right, so as a recap during our November kickoff meeting, you'll remember that we started off with a conversation around adult education funding with a bit of analysis and report from several of our adult education schools. And during that conversation, there was a request to understand more about the distinction between adult education funding and alternative education funding across the sectors. And so we have included in here just a little bit of information about that. There, I think, was strong interest from several members of the group to pursue increases in adult education funding, with acknowledgement that there were some working group members that noted or pointed out that this, as with all recommendations, comes with trade-offs, whether in this situation between adult education or pre-K through 12 funding or between different special populations funding. And then we reviewed some analysis that specifically we'd started focusing on middle school grades to understand the impact of the pandemic there. That conversation expanded a bit further into really a conversation around the impact on the overall cohort and how we think about targeting supports for the cohort of students that have been impacted by the pandemic. And there was conversation of whether it's best to put something like a grade level weight that would structurally change the UPSFF and target a specific grade level rather than a specific cohort of students versus potentially pursuing a more temporary pandemic specific weight or type of funding as we did with the pandemic supplement fund for a potentially longer period of time. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, there was a request to understand more of just what has been the cost impact of previous recommendations to understand the scale and scope for this working group as we move forward with drafting recommendations. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan to just share a bit more detail around the distinction for adult and alternative schools, just to help close out some of that initial conversation from last week or last session.
Thanks, Michelle. And we did discuss this last time. We shared the definitions of adult and alternative over like the chat and through discussion. So we just wanted to share it on slides to have it on record and to just allow you all to just process this again. So what we have on this slide is the definitions of adult education and alternative program that are pulled straight from the DC code section for the UPSFF. So for UPSFF purposes, adult education is defined as services or instruction below the college level for adults who lack sufficient mastery of basic educational skills to enable them to function effectively in society, or do not have a certificate of graduation from a school providing secondary education and who have not achieved an equivalent level of education, or have limited ability in speaking, reading, writing, or understanding the English language, and whose native language is a language other than English. So again, that is pulled straight from the DC code as the definition for adult education. And then also we're sharing the definition for alternative program, which also defined in DC code in the same definitions section, which is defined as specialized instruction for students under court supervision or who have a history of being on short or long-term suspension, or who have been expelled from school, or who meet other criteria as defined by the state education office through rulemaking. To qualify as an alternative program, a school must meet the criteria and rules set by the state education office. An alternative program may describe an entire school or a specialized program within a school. So if you can go to the next slide, Patrice, OSSI did issue rulemaking to define the criteria for being an alternative school. And we issued a new chapter in the DC municipal regulations to define this criteria. And I'm listing, I I pulled out some of the bullet points from the municipal regulations, so this might not be like exactly how it's worded in the regulations, but one criteria is that 75% of the students between 12 and 24 that are enrolled in full-time equivalent instruction are identified as one or more of the following. And then there's a long list here, but just to summarize, it is all of the different at-risk characteristics. So at least 1 year older or more than the expected age for the grade in which the student is or should be enrolled. So that is like the overage characteristic. There's if they qualify for TANF, SNAP, they're experiencing homelessness, or if they're currently involved with or under the jurisdiction of the DC Child and Family Services, so the CFSA. And then the bottom three are additional characteristics that are not at risk, specifically at-risk characteristics. So the student has been expelled from their prior school. The student has a history of being on short or long-term suspension at their prior school, or the student is under court supervision. So again, just to summarize, in order to qualify as an alternative school, well, first of all, the school will need to submit an application to OSSI, and in order for us to grant that school alternative status, we would do this check to see if 75% of their students between the age ranges are meeting, are identified as one of these characteristics. You can go to the next slide, Patrice. There are a few, that is not the only criteria to be identified as an alternative school. There are a few other things that the school would need to show in their application, and those are listed here. So the school mission should include a focus on serving students meeting the criteria from the previous slide, that the school is providing programming, including instruction and academic supports targeted to the students that are meeting the criteria that was on the previous slide. The schools must be providing full-time equivalent instruction with an academic track that's culminating in the first-time completion of a secondary academic credential. And students enrolled in the school include those who have reached the minimum age of 13 and who have not exceeded the maximum age of 24. I'm going to pause because I see some comments in the chat. Is this saying that the school population must be 75% students aged 12 to 24? Let me think about that for 1 second. No, it is not that it is just the students that are between 13 and 24. I think it's 75% of those students must be meeting those characteristics. It's not that 75% must be within that age range. And then your next comment, Abe, or that they don't need to have 75% in this range, but the people that are in it, yes. So yes, it was your second point. And then can kids older than 24 be in an alternative school? So a student that is older than 24 can be enrolled in a school that is defined, that is designated as an alternative school, but the school will not receive the alternative weight for that student. If the student is over 24, then that student, the LEA would receive the adult weight for that student, not the alternative weight. And just to remind everybody, so just the general idea behind the alternative program or the alternative school is that the weight for an alternative student in the per pupil funding is the high school weight plus the at-risk weight. So the idea is that even if all of the students are not at risk, the school is essentially receiving the high school weight plus the at-risk weight for all of the students that are attending that alternative program. Are there any other questions?
Yep, sorry, I also put in the chat, do adult and alternative students with disabilities receive special education funding?
Alternative students do receive special education funding. I don't think that adult students receive special education funding. But that might be on a school by school basis. I don't know if anybody else knows the exact answer to that.
Sorry to interrupt. Adult students do not receive special education funding.
Yeah.
Adult students, I should say, yes, any of them don't receive special education funding.
Yeah. And sorry, Josh, I read your second comment and I thought that you meant nix the comment above and it was just the comma. So I apologize for glossing over that. And Chelsea, can you just clarify your comment, but just up to age 21?
Oh yeah, sorry. For special education funding at alternative schools, is the special education for students up to age 24, or is it just, I thought services were just up to age 22, but before age 22 for some reason, but
That is a good question that I don't know the answer to off the top of my head, so I'll write it down.
I do know the answer to that. It's up to 22. IDEA funding ends at 22. And then they roll into the adult system after that.
Great, thank you, Leicester, and welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Leicester. I think that's an important part of this conversation because I do know that you serve adults who previously would have been qualified as students with disabilities under the age of 21. I think just for Aussie, if you can share, maybe not today, but later, just where are we at in terms of SPED level funding and the recommended weights from the adequacy study and where we're at now?
Yeah, we actually, Josh, we have a slide on where the funding is now, and I'll pull up the adequacy study numbers as we get there and voice that over.
Just the last thing that I'll say before I turn it over is just to reiterate that the alternative school designation is an application process that is open on an annual basis for schools to apply for alternative education status if they want to receive that, if they want to receive the alternative funding.
Can our school receive both adult and alternative funding?
Yes, they can. So again, an alternative program could be a school or a specialized program within a school. So I guess there could be like an alternative program and an adult program in the same school, and we do have some examples of that in the district. And also, again, because the age range for alternative funding is limited between 13 and 24, if there is a student above the age of 24 that is attending an alternative school, then that student would have adult funding through the UPSFF.
But a 19-year-old at an alternative school would receive alternative fund. Would that school receive alternative funding for that student?
Not if
Someone
they're
someone between the age of 18 and 24.
between the age of 13 and 24.
Got it. So that if that student then left and went to an adult school, the school would receive different funding for the same student.
Correct.
Huh.
But I guess like the idea there is that in the alternative program, that school applied for alternative status because they met all of the various criteria. If the student went to a different school that was just an adult school that didn't apply for the alternative status, then I'm presuming that it would be a different academic program that student is partaking in.
Is there any other case where that's true? The same student in two different schools receives two different levels of funding?
The at-risk concentration weight would now have a more complicated but similar effect.
because they could be going to a school where the at-risk concentration is higher or
Correct.
lower or meets one of those thresholds. They
Correct.
could be essentially tipping a school over one of the thresholds, for lack of a better word. Okay.
Yeah, and just to clarify a little further, Abe, like obviously for a school to be alternative status, they need to be offering first time completion of a secondary academic credential, so a GED or a diploma. There's one other that I can't remember off the top of my head. But they could presumably be attending a different school that is not an alternative school where they are not where they are taking courses but not receiving a secondary academic credential. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that it's like it could potentially be two completely different programs that a student is partaking in if they go from one school to another school. And that's what the alternative designation is trying to differentiate.
Sure. I mean, in theory, they could go to a 12th grade at a non-alternative high school if they had the necessary requirements to do that, and then receive a third level of funding if they were of the right age.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Okay.
that's right.
The other, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think I got confused. So am I hearing that if someone is at an adult school and they're between that 13 and 24, they can attend an adult school, get the adult funding formula, and then go to an alternative school? And that school then gets the alternative funding for
Well,
that?
the student could only be enrolled at one school.
Okay, all right, that's, I thought I was hearing that and I thought it could only be one school that they're attending.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry for confusing.
The other category, Abe, would be if a student transferred from a special education school into a non-special education school. So from one of those two schools and vice versa.
And if there's no other questions or comments or anything, then Michelle, do you want to take over?
Great. So another ask coming out from last session was to take a look at the previous working group recommendations and understand a bit about the cost impact of those recommendations, both for what was implemented and what was proposed. So here we pulled together again the slide that we shared, I think a couple meetings ago, that showed from the 2020 working group the series of recommendations. For the ones highlighted in blue, we then have some subsequent slides that show a bit of what the cost impact looked like, either for the recommendation that we were actually able to implement or for the proposal where and when we are able to size that. For some of them, they're a bit too general or we don't yet have that data set because it may not exist to actually size it, but wanted to show some of this in order to give you guys a sense of the scale. So if you go to the next slide, we'll just start at the top here with the overage high school students. And so as folks may remember, this was a supplemental weight added within the overall at-risk bucket for students who are overage and in high school. And so the working group had a recommendation that we apply supplemental weight for students who have 2+ at-risk characteristics. This is obviously one subset of that. We didn't have a specific weight recommendation for that overall population, so we aren't able to size that, but specifically for the high school overage students, the total impact of the implementation that we did was $3.3 million. So we added a 0.06 weight. This impacted about 4,600 students. And so the total cost of that in FY22 across both sectors was about $3.3 million. Did it come from a fixed pool that reduced funding to other categories? Jonathan, no. Yes, in the macro scheme of things, no, in that it's not something that we could say like, well, this $3.3 million came from library collections or library hours, right? It's obviously all fixed within the city budget. But at the same time that, for example, we are formulating the UPSFF, we are also formulating every other city agency's budgets. And so these all kind of convene together at the same time. It isn't necessarily like push and pull in the moment only against the UPSFF.
I just want to make sure I understand, and the way you said it at the end threw me off. There's a fixed pool of funds allocated for UPSFS allocation, including all of the weighted allocations. And so the $3.3 million impact directed to high school overage students came out of that fixed pooled amount, or that fixed amount for UPSFF funding for fiscal year 22. I know that there was an overall increase in the foundational level and others, but is it all, I just want to make sure I understand that it's an additional allocation. There's an allocation from the general budget for the foundation amount, and then there are allocations for the weighted amounts that we also have, and that all goes into the budget separately. So if we add another weighted amount for, redheaded students today, that additional funding would be on top of all of the other funding that has already been approved and would be allocated, or would it pull funding from other student categories?
I think Mary frames this in a good way. It wouldn't pull funding from any other special populations category, right? Unless we, as a result of saying, oh, we want to increase X, we're going to reduce Y, right? Like if we made that as an explicit decision for whatever reason, in this specific scenario for 22, it wasn't pulling from any other category or weight. Now the theoretical implication, and this is obviously like a smaller dollar amount, is then maybe we aren't able to raise the foundation as much as we would have wanted to in the overall balancing of the city's budget. Great. All right, the next one that we have here was the ELL weight recommendation. So there were a couple recommendations here. The first we're showing is what we actually implemented in 22. So we added a secondary ELL weight. We split out elementary and secondary. And for secondary ELL, we increased the weight by 0.25. So it went from 0.5 to 0.75. That impacted roughly 4,000 students and had a total FY22 impact of $11.7 million. So right here, we're only calculating that delta, that change in the weight. They would have gotten the 0.5, just part of the broader ELL category previously. Now they're getting 0.25 more as secondary ELL students. So that was the actual 22 impact. The proposed recommendation was to increase the ELL weight overall across all students to the adequacy study level. So that would have brought it from a 0.5 to a 0.61 for a broader population of students, close to 12,000 students. That would have had an impact of 15.2 million. And then just noting here, there was also a recommendation to add a new to country weight. And that one we were not able to estimate because we don't have the current tracking nor a weight recommendation in order to estimate that. All right, the next one, Ryan referenced this one earlier. We introduced legislation to tie the alternative weight to sum up from high school in the at-risk weight. So that increased the alternative weight from 1.445 to 1.52. It was a 0.075 change in the weight to 2,000 students, and that had a $1.8 million impact in 22. So those were all from the 2020 UPSFF Working Group recommendations and then the level of implementation that we met. There was also an ask kind of separate from the working group to understand the at-risk recommendation from the adequacy study. So this would be if we now look at 23, because now we're talking hypotheticals, take the 23 foundation, the weight change to a 0.37 would be a 0.13 increase against all students who currently meet the at-risk criteria, which is about 43,000 students if we're talking projections. And that theoretically would have been close to $70 million on the FY23 budget. A few things that this does not account for as pieces of context for folks. One, this doesn't take into account the high school overage supplemental weight that was added, or the 0.05 weight for the 40% concentration and the 70% concentration that were added in FY23. This also, on the flip side, does not account for the adequacy study foundation recommendation differential. So the foundation level in the adequacy study was different from the FY15 actual foundation level. And so that, we're talking about pure dollar amounts, has a series of implications if you were trying to get to the dollar amount plus inflation over time. Yes, Abe, if that math all adds up, I'm not gonna attempt to do it right now. The sum of all of those looks approximately right. I'm gonna pause here on those sets of recommendations for reactions. As a reminder for folks, this was a big question coming out of, well, if we're recommending something around adult, can we recommend something else? What's the size of the implication for the adult weight change relative to some of the other weight changes that have been recommended previously?
I guess now is the time to ask questions. Is that correct, Michelle?
Yes, Josh, go for it.
Do you have an Excel document that allows us to kind of like, thank you for this information. That was
Perfect.
really actually it was very helpful. Do you have an Excel document that allows us to sort of like independently sort of play around and understand what recommendations we might want to have as individuals of this committee and what those fiscal impacts would be?
What perfect timing, Josh. It's like we lined you up. Ryan has helped build that tool. Ryan, I don't know if now's the right time to kind of walk through it and share it, and then we'll be sending it out to the group.
Sure, yes. Hold on, I'm going to share my screen. So first of all, I just want to go back, Abe, to your question about the 2020 recs. There was also just like a general recommendation where the working group recommended an increase to the foundation level. That was, I guess, taken into account too, because the foundation level has gone up each year. So just calling that out, that there was that recommendation to increase the foundation level. That was also administered by the mayor. So
Ryan, could I
yeah,
just question on that?
yeah.
It wouldn't be completely accurate to say that that change was a result of the recommendation of this group. That was a requirement of the allocation following additional funding to DCPS, right? Or was it an increase specifically to the foundation funding level, absent any reflection of increased funding?
Are you talking about the Washington Teachers Union contract, or
The annual increase in the amount in the per pupil funding, was that exclusively, was that based on any increase in representative allocation of funding to charters versus what was being spent at DCPS, or was it specifically in relation to the recommendations of this group?
So the working group, I don't believe recommended a specific amount that the foundation level should be increased by, but it was along, let me pull it up. it was recommending increasing the foundation level to account for LEA's anticipated increases in personnel and non-personnel costs, particularly in the pandemic and recovery contexts. So I don't think that there was any not like additional context or clarification around an increase in the foundation level that is like specifically like this is the amount that is needed to be raised for DCPS versus public charter schools. I think. I mean, anybody can help me out on this one, but
Yeah,
that it's just like there is an amount that the mayor decides to increase the weight by each year to cover the increase of costs for all schools.
yeah, as I recall, what we did was we just prioritized that had been, I think, our third or fourth priority, and we raised it up to our first priority in the final recommendations last time.
Yes. Any other comments on that before I share my screen? Okay, let me figure this out. Can you all see my Excel?
Yes. We can also see some Excels behind it, not fully, but just FYI.
Okay. How's
Yeah,
that?
now you're good.
Okay, sorry, I have a lot of spreadsheets open. Okay, thanks.
It's not your only Excel of today.
Yeah, I also like can't see any chat or anything now, so sorry about that. And also, is it large enough on people's screens?
I think a little zoom wouldn't hurt.
Okay.
There you go.
Anyway, I created this tool from Josh's recommendation at the last meeting to help folks gauge sort of like what changes are made to the UPSFF structure and what the costs would be for making those changes. So we can share this out with the group afterwards, but I just wanted to walk everyone through it first. So what we did was we took the current weightings, so our current state of the UPSFF right now, and broke down all of the different grade levels and their weights and the enrollment projections for each of these. So these enrollment projections include DCPS and public charter schools. So these are enrollment projections. These are not based on the audit numbers for this year. And we have all of the weights here. So the grade levels, alternative, special ed schools, adult. We have special education, English language learners. There's a section for residential students. There's the at-risk students, and then there's ESY. And for all of you LEA leaders out there, this should look familiar to you. This is pulled directly from the receipts that Alonzo sends to the charter schools. And this is also the structure that this is called the UPSFF shell that is also shared in the budget books for DCPS and for the public charter schools. So again, left side is current state of the world. The right side is where you can make changes. And I highlighted the cells where you could change the numbers. So the first one being the foundation level. So right now it's $12,419 per student. And then all of the cells here can be changed. I didn't highlight the SPED compliance, the attorney's fees compliance. I didn't highlight the residential because it's such a small subset of the total enrollment. But I did highlight at risk. I didn't highlight the ESY. So technically, like you could change the numbers in that I didn't highlight, but obviously, like the ones that we usually talk about is the at-risk numbers, the EL, the SPED, and then the grade level. So changing any of these numbers will result in a variance from the current state to the proposed state. So just as an example, if we decided that we wanted to raise the foundation level to 12,750, that would be roughly a 2.67% increase to the foundation level. And as you can see, when I made that change, the total variance changed and shows that this 2.67% increase to the foundation level would result in roughly a $53 million increase in the UPSFF funds that would go to both DCPS and for public charter schools. So again, like this is based on the projected enrollments. So don't, if you're playing around with this, don't change the projected enrollments, because then you wouldn't have an apples to apples comparison between the current state and the proposed state. And then I'll just show you an example again. You know, we had talked about increasing the adult weight to 1.0. If we did that, it would be a $5 million variance. So you can show multiple changes at one time. If, you know, we wanted to change grade 3 to 2 instead of 1, you could see that that would be an $82 million increase, plus the $5 million increase for adults is an $87 million increase overall for the changes that are made. So again, we will send this out to everyone so that you can tinker with different weight changes to the foundation level and to all of the grade levels. I will pause there and see if there's any questions. And again, I can't see the chat, so if there's any chats, if someone could read them.
There are several thank yous to you, Ryan, for making this tool.
I just want to echo that. Really, really appreciate this. This is fantastic.
Great. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. So again, we will email this out to you all afterwards. Or as we're having discussions today, if we needed to check on how much something would cost, I'll be happy to plug it in and let you all know.
Chelsea asked if we can adjust to think about what SY 23-24 projections would be or enrollment for 22-23. So I think the challenge right now is 23-24 projection process is underway right now. And so we're working with schools right now to nail down their projections. So I feel like it's still a little tough to put in that information. And then enrollment for 22-23, I think we don't yet have fully audited enrollment. Is that right, Ryan?
Yeah,
I don't remember the timing for that.
And I kept it as I mean, I guess I could have done unaudited enrollment, but we kept it at the projected enrollment just because that's how like the budgeting process works, is when the budget is released for DCPS and for public charter schools, it's based on enrollment projections. So I hear you, Chelsea, like maybe like if we're expecting the enrollment to go up in the next school year, then these numbers might change. But I mean, I'm not sure how much it would change, like our analysis of making changes to the foundation level and the weights. So I guess what I'm saying is we're going to keep these numbers for now, but we can always update them for future analysis once we have them.
I have an observation to make regarding these numbers. Maybe you will help the conversation. The numbers that we have for the proposed budget change, they went down about 700 students right now. Everybody knows that we are working with the pre-audit numbers. We don't have the final audited numbers that will come sometime at the end of January, I think. But right now, the numbers are for the charter schools, that is only the charter schools, kind of 700 students less than the proposed budget. I don't know the detail of the categories where, but I think I'm just talking about the enrollment of the grade level people was reduced by about 700 students. That's a preliminary look at the
Yeah.
numbers.
Thanks, Alonso. And yeah, like our report, the working group report is due by the end of January, so we won't have time to put in the actual audited enrollment numbers for our analysis. And I'm also hesitant to make any changes to the enrollment numbers that we have in the file now, especially because any projected numbers for the next school year like are not finalized yet and will only be finalized when the budget books are actually released. But thank you for the additional context.
Awesome. Unless there are other questions, I'm going to move us to special education. Great. So this is, I would say, helping to continue start a conversation around special education, which I think we've acknowledged in some previous conversations, a little bit of it's a pretty complex set of weights. And so wanted to start with just some baseline information. And so Josh, I know this is where I think you had some commentary that you wanted to chime in with. So I'll pause after I just talk through this slide. But right now we have a lot of special education weights. We're kind of focused here on the base level weights. So level 1, 2, 3, and 4 special education weights. We've included the definition here for the qualifications for each level, which are based on the hours of specialized service, what the current weight is for that weight, and then what that means for a per pupil dollar amount. So for example, for a level 1 student, you get an additional 0.97 weight of the foundation, which equates to $12,046. We've included the projected enrollment. Again, this is 22-23 projections. So the total projected enrollment for level 1 students and what that then equates to in the FY23 budget in terms of allocations for students who are currently receiving level 1 services. We break that down for all of the 4 subsequent levels. So this shows the current weights. I have pulled up the adequacy study recommendations for the proposed UPSFF weight for each category. And that is for level 1, it's 0.33. For level 2, it's 1.199. For level 3, it's 2.592. And level 4, it's 2.578. Oh, I'm reading the whole wrong thing. Sorry. I was reading special education residential. Level 1, I'm going to start again, is 0.88. Level 2 is 1.08. Level 3 is 1.77. And level 4 is 3.13.
Michelle, there's also a special education capacity fund number on that adequacy study. What is that?
I'm going to need someone to help me with the historical information here. That was previously a part of the UPSFF weight, which was removed at some point, and I don't have the history here. So if there's someone else on the call who does have the history on that one, it looks like Josh saying it was a 0.4 weight special education capacity fund that was previously in the UPSFF that was then removed. Both in the not included in the adequacy study recommendation.
Again, I'm speaking sort of like off the cuff, but I feel like that special education capacity weight got added into the levels. But if anybody
remember
knows for
too.
sure, then yeah.
Yeah, that wasn't like a conscious removal or not removal or some reassessment of the levels. It was right. I think it was out for transparency purposes and then was put back in, maybe because of a lawsuit. I can't remember either. But I remember it being baked in as well. We can go find old communications about it.
We're referring to the compliance amount that is there attached to a special education.
No, Alonzo, there used to
is
be
capacity.
a special education capacity weight of 0.4 that we were thinking was removed, and that 0.4 weight was added into each of the the level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4 weights at some point in the past. But I think we need to do a little more research just to remember what happened.
Okay, so again, these all seem higher than what was recommended in the adequacy study based off of. I'm just trying to get a sense of. I also heard from an LEA specifically that they wanted me to bring these up because they thought that they were not meeting the requirements and that they needed support, especially because they serve more level 3 and level 4. So I'm trying to get the disconnect here and understand why are these are substantially higher than what was in the report, or is that 0.4 supposed to be applied to all those levels in the way that we're thinking about it on this slide here?
So I think if you're comparing it to the adequacy study, right? If we're trying to compare it to the adequacy study, if the adequacy study did not include the capacity fund, then I feel like it's not quite apples to apples either way. I think we need to do some more research just to understand what the intent of that was and where it went effectively over the multiple years. But I think if the purpose is comparison relative of current relative to the adequacy study also didn't include that capacity fund in their weight recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I think I just really need to understand that there was definite concern on this from the LA that approached me. So I'm just needing to understand why these weights are higher than recommendations when that's not typical for a lot of these other things that we're talking about. How did we get to that decision, or are they actually not higher and they're lower as was stated to me?
Yeah, I'd be curious to understand more around the rationale for thinking that it's lower than the adequacy study recommendations as well.
The other schools that serve a lot of special education students speak to whether or not they have found it really deficient since it's higher than the adequacy study? Those that are present? Also, I'm sorry I'm late. I was late today.
Yeah, well, the LEA that I'm talking about is one, I guess I can just name it. Well, I probably shouldn't. Is one that serves a lot of level 3 and level 4 students. A specific charter LEA that is designed to serve level 3 and level 4 students.
So are you talking about a weight? I mean, like in a way, we have the high school concentrated weight. Are they saying that when you have a concentration, it costs a lot more?
I don't know. I mean, I think they just came to me with some information and I just wanted to understand because I was looking at seeing differences and didn't quite understand what they were saying. So I think it's incumbent upon me to get additional detail from them as to the circumstance behind their concern.
Yeah, and we will definitely research that capacity weight, and we'll come back with to the next meeting with some additional context on that stuff.
Just to clarify, this weight goes on top of the other weights.
That is correct. Yeah.
So I think that's important to understand, that if they're a high school student in a concentrated session, they would also get the at-risk concentration, and the high school weight in addition to this weight for those 3 and 4 level students, level 3 and level 4.
That's correct. Yep. All right, I'm going to go through the next couple slides as well, and then we'll open up for discussion. So we pulled here from the most recent PARC data that we have, ELA, and then the next one is math proficiency by subgroup. So we previewed some of this in the last meeting, and then there was just a question of just understanding a bit more, because if folks remember, we showed some of the decreases, and there was, I think, curiosity of why the decrease looked small for special education. We voiced this over last time, but wanted to just put the information out there. The blue dots on here represent the proficiency rate in 18-19, and then the red dots represent the proficiency rate in 21-22. And so these charts from OSSE show the change from blue to red of 18-19 to 21-22. And we've just called out here the comparison for special education versus non-special education. The blue and red dots are fairly close together. There was a small decline, but that is in the context of starting at a significant gap in proficiency rates already. And so I think what we voiced over there that I think is just important to have the context on is we're already starting from a very low proficiency level. And so there's not far to fall. This one is ELA, and then the following one is math. So again, the blue is the historic from 18-19, and then the red is current from 21-22 in terms of PARC proficiency for math, with special education versus non-special education highlighted. So before we move on to the next topic, wanted to pause here because just based on the conversation last time, there was interest in understanding a bit more around performance for special education students, the current funding structure, as this group considered whether they wanted to explore any recommendations around special education weights, either for the near term, or I think there was also just a desire to emphasize looking at special education in the adequacy study as well.
Jack has a question. Does OSSE spend funds educating children in non-public schools outside of the UPSFF? Yes, there is a non-public tuition budget that the district has that is used to pay the tuition for those students that are attending non-public schools.
Could I ask, has there been any exploration? I thought when we talked about it 2 years ago, it was also, do we have these levels right? It wasn't exactly on the funding of the levels. It is like, is the way that we're thinking about special ed the best way to deliver the service? So we're not prepared to do that or have the time, but I'm wondering, is that being done anywhere where there's an evaluation, like is the gap between the 8 and 16 hours and the 16 and 24? Are we missing students in that? Are the hours the best way to think about it? So it's a much larger research question, but I wonder, is OSSE looking at that, or I'm just curious?
Kathy, I think that would be sorry, go ahead, Brian. Or whoever.
I think we might have been ready to maybe say the same thing. I'm not exactly sure how much OSSE is looking at it from a funding perspective, but I think what Michelle was going to say is that it is something that could be explored, or I guess we could take recommendations for exploring this in the adequacy adequacy study?
Yeah, that's the direction that I was going to go in as well. That a recommendation from the working group could be to pressure test and think about whether these level definitions and or thresholds are the right ones for our student population and student needs.
Yeah, I think that was what I was thinking. I was sort of aligned with what Kathy was saying, and I think what you're saying, Michelle. I was just wondering, given the way that we're spending money in special education, whether we're putting people in a position to be successful in educating more kids within our schools instead of in non-public schools, and wondering, whether there are differences that could make a big difference in outcomes. Particularly, I'm haunted by the landscape analysis, where we see that 0% of children in DC who are identified for special education go back into general education, which lags the rest of the country. So it just strikes me that there's something we should be doing just to think about that a little more, and see what we could do to change that.
So that would become before the money. We would have to look at, I would be in favor of a recommendation that wanted to just look at this a lot more.
Yeah.
And if we could bring more of what goes out of public into public, and what we could learn about how to do it better. Do you have the numbers on how many we send to non-public and how much we spend on that?
Ryan dropped in the chat in this fiscal year, the budget for non-public is about $60 million. And then Patrice, if you can go back to the levels slide. Just to frame that. Oh, there we go. Yep. I think we're going the wrong direction. Yep. Any other reactions from others on this topic or the proposed recommendation that Kathy and Jack have outlined?
This is Abe. I moved to the phone. I think it's a great recommendation to explore further study of outcomes and from a funding perspective.
My question would be, what outcomes would we be studying? Not especially for students at SPED level 4, a lot of them are taking the alternative assessment versus the regular park assessment. Like I know that they're supposed to be equivalent, but I think in practicality they say different things. Just curious as to what outcomes we would want to look at.
I hope we would even look at a different way of thinking about it. I mean, I don't have all of that, but I mean, the park makes sense for some of the children that I've met beyond level 4. You wouldn't be doing anything like the park. You would, so I just hope we look at it. We want them to be as close to being able to function in an environment as they can, and how we can do that. I'm sure there's a whole world of definitions and ways to look at this out there that I don't know. Isn't that right?
Chelsea makes a good recommendation. IEP goal attainment, if that exists.
I don't know if this is available, but it seems like something that it is tailored to individual students and what they're trying to get out of these services that are funded by these resources through the UPSFF.
Yeah.
Just so others can react as well, I'm going to read out Mary's comment from the chat. Using the hour-based levels disadvantages charter schools with more costly disability categories and advantages those with less costly disability categories. Underfunding generally disadvantages all schools, but has to be identified. I would recommend a cost out of IEPs plus the services not included in IEPs, such as assessment, dedicated aides, paperwork generally. Mary, can you expand a little bit on the disability categories distinction that you're making?
Yes, we went through this whole process many years ago, and we got data from DC Public Schools, which we enabled a cost out of IEPs. And what we found was that the IEPs for disability categories like speech problems and learning disabilities were much cheaper within the hour-based levels than the IEPs for kids, for example, with autism. So you could have the same amount of money going to each LEA for, say, level 3, but it overfunded schools with a lot of speech disability kids and no autistic kids, and underfunded those with autism.
Mary, why was that different between charters and DCPS?
Well, because we were using DCPS data, it all washed out for DCPS because they distribute the funds, by their criteria anyway. But for charter schools, it didn't work. Now, since that time, we don't really know the basis of the hour-based. It could have changed. I mean, a lot of things have happened since we did that study years ago. And that's why it seems to me that it would be useful to cost out IEPs. And we have a lot more technical capacity to do that kind of thing now. And it wouldn't require anybody knowing any data that would identify. I mean, that's, one of the challenges in doing that kind of thing is that you want to very carefully limit data that would identify individual kids. But I think that there are now databases that would have all that could be analyzed to figure out just how much do the IEPs in every disability category cost. And you could do a much more finely tuned schedule for funding special ed. Now, one alternative would be you could just fund IEPs and have the money follow the students. I mean, I'd want to think about whether that's truly feasible. But if you funded IEPs and then added something in for the non-IEP services, I would think you could do that. But you'd want to look at that carefully before trying it. But right now it's a funding system that's a little on the crude side, and it does have an impact.
I was just going to jump in and say, Mary, I really like the idea of looking at how much it costs maybe per hour and per level, if I'm hearing this right, because level 3 and 4, an hour might cost more than for 1 and 2. And I'm not sure that that's fully contemplated in the current weightings. And just looking at your original chat comment, I'll piggyback on the dedicated aids comment, because that's definitely one that comes up in our schools, and I know our instructional folks would certainly support, especially when it comes to level 4 students, and a level 4 student who might require their own dedicated aid and an IEP that's not included here in the funding formula.
Yeah, and I can supply, what we did long ago doing this cost out. I mean, it was part of a report to the state education officer, that being the predecessor to the state education, the state superintendent of education. I mean, this is all public documentation, and I have it, and I happily send it to people.
Is part of what we're also saying that the hour is one way to measure, but depending on the disability, it could be widely divergent in terms of how much it costs, even if it's the 8-hour range, it might be a severe disability. So that I think it is in our recommendation to look at to actually go into the disability level, which would be noted on the IEP, and look at if this is the best way.
Yeah, no, that was what we found. And at the time we were looking at, should we do it by, the 8-hour increments in hours of service, or should we do it by disability level? And by doing it, I mean, kind of disability. And doing it by kind of disability, no, that was more crude than doing it by hours of service.
Well, it seemed you needed a combination. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I'm just wondering if you couldn't at least do a combination.
Question about that. If the same two students have the same number of hours, but one has a dedicated aid and one does not, the student with the dedicated aid, the school or the LEA receives no more funding than the student without the dedicated aid?
Yeah, on average. I mean, because what we did was we simply added in the cost of dedicated aids. We knew what the total was, and we, built that in. I mean, but there are other costs. Assessment costs money. And then we looked at how much it cost just for all the staff work doing the paperwork. The staff at schools spends a pretty fair amount of time doing the paperwork.
Thanks for that.
Great. I think we can, as we start to build out draft language for the report incorporate some of this conversation in there as well. So thank you, folks. All right, so on that topic, wanted to summarize here some of initially what we have heard from folks. This is just very initial things for folks to react to. That eventually, as we develop language and share the more expansive language, will also look for feedback on that, but wanted to start some of that conversation with what we have heard thus far, including at the top, support for increasing the adult weight to 1.0, which is the adequacy study level, with some acknowledgement of the potential trade-off with pre-K through 12 funding or other special populations funding. The other is a consideration of a pandemic-specific targeted weight or fund to address the cohort of students who've been most impacted by the pandemic. For example, money following current elementary school students is something that we heard, or an extension of the pandemic supplement fund for more years. And then there were mixed perspectives on at-risk funding just over the course of multiple sessions. I think there's some continued recommendation to increase the at-risk funding to the adequacy study levels, while in some earlier sessions we also heard holding on changes to at-risk funding given the recent updates that were made to weights to hold and see the effects and impacts of those changes. And then I think the fourth one that we've talked about today is the special education, the recommendation to look at special education levels and how we're defining those and categorizing students relative to the needs of services through the adequacy study.
Can I ask again, Michelle, that on the third bullet point, that whenever we're talking about at-risk funding, we include that there are still issues with the definition of at-risk funding, which undercounts schools with higher levels of students arriving from other countries who might not qualify for SNAP or TANF.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm making a note of that.
From my perspective, I don't think it's fair to say that I don't like the words mixed perspectives on at-risk funding. I don't think it's mixed perspectives on at-risk funding. I think we all agree that, like, well, maybe we don't all agree. I will say for myself that I don't want there to be any mixed thoughts about the fact that we should be funding at students designated as at risk at the recommended levels from the adequacy study period. That yes, there are these other things that are also important, the high school overage and the at-risk concentration, which are also important, but I don't think that negates the fact I would still recommend that we increase the weights on at-risk to the funding levels on the adequacy study until there's a different study that tells us differently.
And the only thing that gives me pause is we spent the whole 2 years ago, we spent the whole time on at risk. Like if we're going to make a recommendation, I'd kind of want to go back over that a little bit. If we're going to just do that again. I think that's why it says mixed. And maybe that's just because of what it says in the first one. These all affect one another. But I'd be willing to think about that. Just think about the way it's worded and what my feelings about it are.
This is a public meeting, so I'll state my opinion here. I'd take the trade-off on increasing the at-risk weight to the recommended level versus an overall increase in the UPSFF.
So that's fair. We'll look at that.
And I would counter that for schools where the at-risk numbers are undercounted, or where that perception exists, targeting that as the recipient rather than an increase in UPSFF might warrant addressing how at-risk is defined to better capture students who need the additional funding.
I guess the other thing is that the ESSER funding is all that other funding leaves. It's going to be tough to say we'll have to look at the foundation level and what the impact of these different things.
I mean, I think too, honestly, what both Jonathan and Josh are saying, and Kathy, your statement is tough is not even the close to the right word. Um, that what our city, I can't speak for the nation, is being asked to do is actually something that we haven't never done in the cliff or stop sign, brick wall, whatever you want to name it as, is already starting to impact the decision making that we're doing right now. And so, where I will say that the Jonathan and Josh's other role is actually at and, because it what we know to be true about what's working, whether it is the during the day tutoring, whether it is the 2 teachers per classroom, whether it is bringing in residents to kind of train in our system to understand our system, like we're able to do right now, only because, to your point, Kathy, of ESSERS. But if we really want these things to be foundational to what we believe are true about education, like it has to be an and.
The other thing, I'm sorry I missed some of the discussion at the beginning about just how we distribute adult versus alternative versus high school weights through that. I was surprised as I was looking into Goodwill, who has 420 ninth graders, and that school is all adults. I think, referencing the full discussion at the beginning, it would be good to get a better understanding of how we're serving, how we're defining all of that. Like, we don't have a definition on high school students or on adults, or on if all adults who are in a ninth grade high school class get qualified as high school students, and then students in an alternative setting get a much higher weight as alternatives, and then no wonder the adult schools feel underfunded. So anyway, I'm going to go back and listen to the whole beginning conversation, but I think our recommendation would have to flesh some of that out.
And Kathy, are you saying it should flesh out just how we're defining and making the distinctions between each of the high school students, adult students, and students in alternative setting? Just
Yeah,
want to make sure I'm
because
capturing it correctly.
we fund them so very differently. Like, we're funding the alternative setting at 1.52. I mean, the difference between high school, alternative, and adult, even though they're all serving, many of the students in all 3 of those categories are kind of in the same age range. So maybe we're just defining the services at those different schools. I mean, I think a number of the adult schools do offer high school courses. So, maybe it's just how you said, I know that to be an alternative setting, you make an application and you're approved. So maybe it's just clarifying. I'm saying that it should just be clarified. And when I saw that Goodwill had 420 ninth grade students, I was surprised, because I know that that is an adult charter school. So maybe it is kind of clarifying how does that work? And does it mean that any school offering high school courses at the ninth grade level qualifies for high school funding? Because then you might as well get that instead of adult. If you're gonna, you should offer some high school courses, because then you can get that high school weight. So I just think we have to figure that out. And I'm sorry that I missed the discussion at the beginning, but if we have an adult school that's qualifying now for all high school funding, we should make clear what the difference is.
I think I just want to clarify. I do believe that Goodwill Excel Center is a high school, not an adult school.
Well, all of their literature says it's Goodwill Adult. And it's a good place. I mean, I think it brings people in to do lots of things. Maybe their sole purpose is to have you graduate from high school. But anyway, I'm just saying that should be clear. if this is what it is.
Yeah, I do believe they provide multiple services, Kathy, and one of right, a lot of those services are for adults. I do believe that the Excel Center itself is a high school.
For adults.
Yes.
Oh, I just am getting that from their website, Josh. So that's fine. We can, we don't need to, I just want it to be clear how, then. Just the definition, just what these different things are and then what the service is. That's why it's raised to 1.0 because this is what we want to provide for adults. It's this because this is what we want to provide for high school students, and this because of what we provide for alternative students.
Yes, I mean, it's complicated because so I think Goodwill is focused, does Carnegie units. And it is an adult high school, but they use the nomenclature of a high school, you know, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade. But they are serving adults in their high school. So I think, and it's a Carnegie unit base, whereas other adult schools are doing education. I mean, it's reading, writing, math, science. That's what's, and their individuals are working towards. It's not about seat time or any of that. It's really helping adults to pass the high school equivalency or meet the competencies for the National External Diploma Program. So it just depends on the route one takes to get a high school credential.
Great. I think it was just confusing because they were all 9th graders. So that's fine. I mean, I just think it should be clear. Certainly that's the way the state programs were set up to, you know, to make sure that adults, that any student at any person at any point in the district could go back and get their high school diploma. That was what that was set up to do.
I just have a quick question. I just wanted some clarification. And maybe I missed this, Michelle. The support for increasing the adult weight to 1.0 with some acknowledgement of potential trade-offs with pre-K through 12 funding. I'm just, I think it's similar to some of the other comments that were made. It really puts, I mean, I just love to hear a little bit more about, and maybe I missed it in the last meeting, of what those trade-offs were, because it then sort of positions just as the at risk, you know, adults as sort of taking from K-12. And we know that there's a lot of tension around, you know, just the perception of adult schools and what adult schools are. And I'm just curious, what are the trade-offs, and are these trade-offs what we think are significant trade-offs for kids?
Yeah, I think this is just a reflection of from last conversation, very similar to I think how Josh articulated for at risk. You know, do I want the money to go to at risk or do I want to go to the foundation level? Josh shared his perspective that he would rather have it go towards at risk funding, right? Like that trade-off, to Ashley's point, exists for many of these. It came up during the conversation around adult from some individuals. So we were just naming that in this bullet here. And we can continue to change and refine language, whether it's acknowledgement that across the board there are trade-offs, etc.
Michelle, just a comment regarding what Kathy said regarding goodwill. If the category in reality, they have 405 students at level 9, but they are receiving $15,000, $151 per student. If they were to be in the category of just adults, even at the level of 1 point, which is the proposal, they will be just getting $12,419 at the level that we have right now. So being in the category of 9, they are being funded, you know, at a higher level. They would be underfunded if they were be in the category of adult. They are not classified as adult. They are all in grade 9.
Can I just jump in quickly on the comment I had put in the chat, or really the question around SNAP and TANF on the at-risk definition? There were a couple responses, and Jonathan, I totally understand your point there in terms of folks not being counted as at risk because they qualify, but they you know, are in non-citizen households. I guess my question was coming from: are there other folks that are not being counted, or that will later on be not counted? So I was asking, like, is it just the qualification, or does the family actually have to be receiving services which might require an application and going through a process to receive SNAP or TANF? And if it's qualify, then I guess I don't have much follow-up, but if it's qualify and go through the process and receive, then I guess I'd be worried that there's undercounting either currently or at some point, I believe. And I'm a little bit out of my depth here, and so I'm sure there's someone on this call who knows better than me, but during the pandemic, I know at-risk count just increased generally, but I believe as well, part of that reason might have been that some folks were just considered at risk. They didn't need to reapply for anything. So I would just be worried if there at some point that were to go away, that the at-risk count that's increased but is truer to what the true at-risk count would be. I'd be worried that that would decrease if there were certain, whether it's an application or other kind of factors that they would need, that a family would, steps they need to go through to get counted as at risk. Again, my comments don't really apply if it's just qualify and no one needs to take extra steps. Is anyone familiar? That number just comes for us, the at-risk number comes from—
I think you have to be a recipient of it because our data stream is from DHS. Our OSSI's data stream is from DHS, and so it's coming from the recipients of SNAP or TANF. Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong here.
No, I think you are right, Michelle.
So I worry that there's undercounting happening there as well. And again, I'm not super familiar with how things changed during the pandemic, but this was something that had come up in passing in a conversation. So I just I wonder if if something were to change, if that count would decrease based on the application process.
I think I might have mentioned this point in a previous meeting, and it connects with something Jonathan was saying earlier about at-risk funding not getting to students from immigrant families. If the intent of at-risk funding is to serve students from low-income households, one other way to count at-risk status could be through families who are receiving DC Alliance healthcare insurance, because there is another income verification process that they have to go through there, but it doesn't rely on their residency status like SNAP and TANF do. And it's data collected by DHS.
Yeah, I think the other important thing here is that it was meant to be a proxy in a sense. Like, it's just a way to get additional funding to schools that needed additional services to support the kind of students that they have. right? Like we even know that when we moved to a $15 minimum wage, which was a great move, that bumped up some other, 15 plus 2, 15 plus 3, 15 plus 4 jobs that no longer that don't meet sort of like the kind of funding that you need to raise a family of 4 in the District of Columbia, but doesn't no longer meets federal thresholds. Again, so I think it's just a proxy to get to schools and LEAs that serve more of these students and families that need additional services to be successful at school. I would hope, but if there's some unequal distribution of these other students that we're not currently capturing, I would love to know how and why and how we can support them.
I don't think I would have thought of this until Miss Johnson. Always, I'm afraid to mess up her name. Named this about the target trade-off bit. I guess I'm curious. Like, I know every year in the mayor's in that February time period, we're saying, imagine you have $100. What would you distribute? It is the assumption that the percentage must be the same in terms of the chunk of the city funds that are dedicated or allocated to providing a high quality education in the city. Is that an assumption that we are working with, I guess, in this? Because all three considerations actually have that restraint in many ways. Like either it is like trade-offs for pre-K funding, as long as we're able to do the supplemental funding, or is there an opportunity for this group to say, no, actually it was 25%, but it really should be 30% of the city budget. I don't know what the number is. And I say that unfortunately, trying to figure out like safe instruction for a student who lost his brother to a murder on Saturday, knowing another school leader who lost 2 students in a month. That there is something about like this assumption that like if we maintain or if we move just the needle a little bit more, it's going to solve our educational ills, where what we're experiencing outside of the school building is a direct result of what happened in the schools for the past 15, 20 years. And so I worry that if we are not bold here, especially when we're talking about students with disabilities, at-risk students, adult education, that we are in many ways co-signing the outcomes that we have on our walks to our car right now.
I guess I would add to that what we have right now is the schools have assumed, education budget has assumed a huge amount of some of the obligations of a city. Whether it's the mental health, whether it's with all the ways that
to the double man, Kathy, yes.
So that I think that's what I'm feeling is we just take it all in and say we're going to do it all. Then yeah, maybe we should have 50, 60% of the budget. But is that what we're equipped to do? Or what are we, do we want affordable housing? We want recreation. We want these other agencies to also, I mean, this is a much larger conversation, but I have been concerned at the level of responsibility that we have placed on the schools. Even I think that's part of what happens. Like, we're supposed to really now take care of 3 years old through your entire adult life. And all these people need these services, but they are coming to education to get the services. And are we, how does that all look? So to your point, do we just go out bold and say, yes, education is going to do it all? We're going to provide career services wherever you are in your life. We're going to be there for everything. Or are we trying to figure that out? That's what we're trying to figure out. But the safety is a huge thing. And for you, for your student and for your colleagues, And I've certainly been through that a number of times. And we're back there with that rate of being really high. Is that what we're funding though? Is that what our recommendations, is there some way we phrase something that gets at that?
I think that's a good question, Kathy. And I really would love to see if Demi could step in and help answer that. But like, to me, I would love to be a part of a group that recommends like, this is the amount of money that is required to ensure success for every student in the District of Columbia. And maybe if that actually isn't productive for the deputy mayor, then tell me what else that we need to do in addition to that that is productive and helpful for the deputy mayor as that entire city budget gets formed.
I'm pausing because I think it's a lot of very big questions. Because there's a couple pieces in here, right, Kathy, to your point of the role of the schools and the role of the city. And the burden that we place on schools to carry out services outside of core instruction, right? And that are taking time, resources, care to serve all of those purposes. And so I think it's grappling with how to answer, because I think it's a
Yeah, I don't have any.
I don't know quite how to answer that. I don't think that, Raymond, to your like where we started this question of like, are we assuming that education has to stay at the same proportion of city funding for like for the next fiscal year or forever? Like, I don't think we have to assume that.
Exactly. So I think that's what exactly. I think we shouldn't assume that in this group. And I think that's why our recommendations need to not be construed as trade-offs within our own within our own sphere of education. I think we need to be bold and clear about the rationale behind it and base it in data and the previous adequacy studies.
They're so old now. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think the reality is that in order to decouple, the triple, the quadruple the functions that schools are doing right now, there has to be a way of like, okay, we're going to support you through this period while we transition the other, whoever these agencies are supposed to do, to take them on. But right now, our recommendations and past recommendations, and I really would not have thought of this until we caught that trade-off piece, is like, we're funding you to instruct, and all those other things you just do in secret, versus we know you are taking this on, and so we're going to fund you to take this on while we get these. I'm not a public official. These other agencies act in gear, because like the direct outcome of DC housing not doing what I would think makes sense is that I'm helping a family figure out housing, or a direct outcome of SROs disappearing is that we're figuring out safety and security throughout our building and neighborhood. And so the trade-offs are actual, like, and I don't, maybe the other buckets are getting shaved somewhere else too, but like, I am terrified that if we send something that is similar than past years, we're going to get the same outcome.
I want to be mindful of time. I don't want to stop this conversation between folks, but I do want to make sure we have opportunity for public comment as well. I know we do have a few folks from the public, so do want to open up. We should continue this conversation, but if there are comments from the public as well, folks should please feel free to raise their hand.
Yeah, you can raise your hand or you can send me a direct message and I can take you off mute and then you can make a comment. So please, if there's any people from the public that would like to make a public comment, now is the time to raise your hand. And we do have one. So Julie, I'm going to take you off mute. Can you just say your name and, if applicable, your organization? And let's try this.
My name is Julie Camerata. I'm from the DC Special Education Cooperative. And I just wanted to double click on a couple of points that were made by the group. I think that when you're considering the funding levels and level 4, especially, I think that it is somewhat of a black box data-wise. I have not seen a breakdown of where kids get their services. So for example, a student might be level 4 and sitting in a general ed classroom, but with full-time academic supports or with a dedicated aide. Or they could be sitting in a self-contained classroom. Or they could be sitting in a self-contained classroom with a dedicated aides. And I think all of those have dramatically different costs. So as you move forward, I would suggest considering that and looking into what the breakdown is. I know that there was discussion about the using a model that was based on services or hours of service. I wanted to just bring up, because I've been around a long time, and as many of you have, and Tammy Lewis, when she was at OSSI, was looking at the model that Florida uses for its special ed costs. And I believe they use an hourly model based on hours of service. So that might be something worth looking into.
Great, thank you so much, Julie.
Julie has been around for a long time. It would be great to have. Thank you. If we're going to make any recommendation about special ed, I think we should consult with people like Julie, who have been in the field and, know that. So to help us phrase what we would do, and we could also then reference previous, whether what Mary did years ago or what Tammy did, so that it's a robust recommendation about what we're looking at. And Julie would be great to consult with on.
And I'm not seeing any other public comment at this time. Okay, I do have one more, sorry. So Michelle, I'm gonna take you off mute. And hi, can you just say your name?
I was just going to type it in, but this will be quicker. I just wanted to also, I think it was mentioned just at the beginning of the sharing of the special education data during the meeting. And I think Michelle had said, identify that the data was showing that the dots looked closer together than they had been, than we anticipated, right? But the reason for that is because the pandemic, yes, exacerbated how poorly the achievement and growth data, the growth data and achievement data, but schools haven't really been producing very positive outcomes for students with disabilities. previous to the pandemic. And knowing that and seeing that outcome data and the landscape analysis that was released about a year or so ago, the number of students who are going from level 3 to a lower level or being exited from special education has not decreased at all. This is both DCPS and also with the entire sector, DC sector, when it comes to levels. And the outcome data has never changed. And so I just wanted to just double stamp on those things. It's not just because of the pandemic data. And I am not sure the best way to have the dollars follow students with disabilities, but what I do know is it's been several years since any of those weights have changed, and students continue to have very, very poor outcome data. And so we need to do something different, if not thinking about the weights, but also how those weights, the funding for those weights are utilized across LEAs, especially thinking about the quality materials requirements and IDEA. And so I just wanted to get that off my chest and share that as well.
Great, thank you so much, Michelle. And I don't see any more public comment. So we do only have about 4 minutes left. I just want to remind everyone that our next meeting is on December 15th. Thanks, Patrice. There's 2 weeks from now, 3 to 5 p.m.
And we
definitely go ahead, Michelle.
I was gonna say we'll likely use a pretty big chunk of that time to talk about specific language around recommendations. So we've been taking notes from this conversation, the back and forth that folks were having, and recommendations that people had. So we will capture some of that ahead of next meeting for folks to, again, have something to react to. And if there are folks who feel strongly about a specific thing that they want to help craft the language for folks to react to, would welcome that as well.
Yeah, agreed. And as a reminder, I will send the cost analysis tool out to all the working group members. And in that email, Michelle, I think we can also solicit language that people would like to propose to share with the group for the next meeting.
Josh, it looked like you were raising your hand.
Yeah,
physically.
Yeah, raising my hand. We had talked earlier on in this process about middle school, and I put this note in the comment section. Did we discuss middle school? Did I miss that conversation? Are we planning on not discussing middle school and really before we need to make final recommendations?
So we talked about middle school last session. We shared some of the assessment data there. I think the conversation evolved during that from, I think, some folks saying rather than looking at the assessment data, should we be focused on elementary school instead of middle school, seeing where some of the drops had been, and then that continued to evolve into, should we be looking actually at just something targeted for the pandemic specifically? Happy to continue and revisit that conversation. Josh, if there's specific things that you had in mind you want to talk with the group, we can add that to the agenda for next meeting as well.
I'll think about that.
Sorry, Josh. A quick process question. So just looking at the chat, there's a bunch of things about, hey, maybe we should loop Julianne and tagging in Mary's kind of previous research. Like, is there space for, is that something that maybe you all will take on in between this and the next meeting, or what could that look like?
Yeah, I think we could potentially bring Julie in for the next meeting. I'm gonna volunteer her while she's still on the meeting, to help, give some of that overview as well during the conversation next meeting. But we will take on, I think, connecting with Julie offline between now and then, to understand what we can pull together for the group to help further the thinking here.
This is from having been on this committee many, many years ago, where it met for a much longer period of time. Like I think for the task before us, the number of meetings that we have and the level of research that's needed, it's really a big lift. So just throwing that in there, if we're going to do things like special ed and adults and middle schools, we need more time to get it right. We can't just slap it on at the end. So I don't know if it's in the law that we start meeting, that we have a certain number of meetings or whatever it is, but we used to meet for a good part, Mary might remember, but we developed, it was a long time with a lot of perspectives. So I think we do the best we can with the time that we have.
Mhm.
But if we're going to tackle these things, we would need more time.
We met once a month all year.
Yeah, that's my memory. And it actually built up the relationships.
Yeah.
It gave a chance to really get the research. That's big, way bigger than where we are right now. But it did make the recommendations much meatier, much heavier on the research and the thought and the consensus.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. It is now after 5, so I do want to wrap up. If there's any other comments or anything, you can certainly email Michelle, Patrice, and I, and we'll make sure to get as much of that into the next meeting, which again is December 15th. So yeah, thank you, everybody. So we will now close out the meeting. Hope you all have a good day.
Thank you.
Michelle, I do have one question if we can